Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine the two biggest economies on the planet are basically in standoff.
Right.
They're ratcheting up tariffs,
Yeah.
pressure, and there's this whole region caught squarely in the middle, feeling every bit of it.
That region being Southeast Asia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what we're really digging into today.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here, I think, is seeing how that really high-level global tension, this potential trade war between giants, it doesn't just stay up there in the headlines or in boardrooms. It translates down into incredibly real pressures, difficult choices, even like daily anxieties for the countries, the businesses, and the people on the ground.
Absolutely. So this deep dive, it's focusing specifically on how these U.S.-China trade tensions have, well, basically transformed Southeast Asia into a pretty significant battleground. We're pulling from a stack of sources today, some really insightful reporting, expert analysis to try and get a close look at this complex, sometimes, well, pretty painful dynamic.
And our mission really is to cut through some of the noise, extract the key insights, understand the pressures because they're coming from both Washington and Beijing.
Right, distinct pressures.
Definitely. And weigh the opportunities this is creating, because there are opportunities, but also, maybe most importantly, highlight the very real risks these Southeast Asian nations are facing.
We want to understand what this truly means for them, and maybe what it signals for the bigger global economic picture.
Yeah.
So for you listening to this, we want to give you a really clear, kind of grounded picture of this incredibly difficult balancing act these countries are performing right now.
So let's set the stage a bit. You've got the United States and China locked in this trade dispute. And the sources we're looking at suggest it's hardening possibly into, well, a long and painful conflict. And that tension is really drawing battle lines, sharp focus right there in Southeast Asia.
And you can see that pressure coming, like you said, clearly from both sides.
Yeah.
Let's start with China. Just recently, China's leader, Xi Jinping, he did this notable three-nation tour, Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia. What was the message there? I mean, even without, say, directly naming the U.S. or President Trump.
Well, the sources really highlight how intentional his messaging was, clearly aimed at the current trade climate. So, for instance, in Vietnam, he explicitly invited Hanoi to join China in opposing unilateral bullying.
Which sounds like code for.
Pretty much code for countering U.S. tariffs, yeah. Then in Malaysia, he talked about recent shocks to global order and economic globalization. Again, a clear nod to the disruption from these trade disputes.
Right.
And with Cambodia, he discussed resisting hegemony, power politics, and bloc confrontation. These are, terms Beijing consistently uses to critique U.S. trade actions, specifically those tariffs.
And it wasn't just talk, though, was it? The scale of his trip, the agreements.
Yeah.
That signals something more concrete.
Oh, absolutely. He signed over 100 agreements across those three countries, covering, everything from infrastructure, technology, to education and health. It's significant.
How was that received? Did it land well?
Apparently so, in many quarters. Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim was quoted saying something like, "In these trying times, the world yearns for steadiness. We see this in China's conduct."
Interesting.
Yeah, and Lynn Cook at Brookings had this interesting analysis suggesting she projected stability, conveyed that China has what the United States currently now lacks: friends.
Friends.
And David Shear, former U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, he basically observed that the Chinese, quote, stand to gain hugely from clumsy American international economic policy.
Okay, so China's coming in with big investment promises, a political message, partners against U.S. trade policies. But are there strings attached or maybe some warnings mixed in?
Definitely not all carrots. The sources are clear on that. According to Yuan Tantun, that's a platform run by China's state broadcaster, Beijing basically issued a warning, that it would punish countries if they make agreements with the U.S. that are seen as harming Chinese interests. The quote is pretty stark. "If anyone uses China's interests as a bargaining chip or as a gesture of goodwill to the U.S., China will firmly respond to it."
Wow. Okay, so that definitely adds a layer of risk for these countries when they're dealing with Washington.
Exactly.
Right, so that's the pressure from China. Now let's flip it. What about the pressure from the U.S.? What are the sources telling us?
Well, on the U.S. side, the main pressure point is tariffs.
Yeah.
Steep tariffs, and not just on China anymore, but increasingly on goods coming from Southeast Asian countries themselves.
Right.
The tariff levels on Chinese goods imposed by the U.S. and China's retaliation. The sources describe them as basically amounting to an embargo in some cases. We're talking as high as 245% from the U.S., at least 125% from China, Huge numbers.
And the U.S. is also really focused on this thing called transshipping. Can you unpack that a bit? Why is that such a pressure point?
Sure. Transshipping is essentially rerouting goods. So Chinese exports get sent to a third country, say Vietnam. Maybe they undergo some minor processing there, maybe not much at all.
Okay.
And then they're exported to the U.S. The goal is basically to disguise their origin to avoid those specific U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods.
Trying to get around the tariffs.
Exactly. And the U.S. is putting major pressure on Southeast Asian countries to crack down hard on this, calling it trade fraud.
Is that pressure working? Are countries like Vietnam, are they actually doing something about it?
It seems so. The sources indicate Vietnam did make a pretty significant concession to the U.S. just this month. They agreed to crack down on this trade fraud, which would include that kind of rerouting.
So that shows the U.S. still has considerable leverage.
It does. Direct leverage.
It's also interesting how aware the U.S. leadership seems to be of China's moves. I saw President Trump commented on Xi's trip.
He did. And the quote in the sources is quite blunt. He said, "I don't blame China. I don't blame Vietnam." Trying to figure out, how do we screw the United States of America?
Yikes. That kind of rhetoric probably doesn't help these countries caught in the middle.
Not at all. It really just highlights the impossible position many of them are in. Rick Waters, a former State Department official, he's quoted saying it directly. The Americans are going to put pressure on them. The Chinese are going to put pressure on them. And inevitably, this puts smaller countries in a tougher spot.
So how are they managing this pressure cooker situation? It sounds incredibly tough, but the sources also hint there might be upsides. A dilemma, sure, but maybe also opportunity.
Exactly right. While the risks are definitely significant, there are real opportunities emerging from all this friction. One of the most obvious is the relocation of Chinese manufacturers.
Ah, right, to avoid the U.S. tariffs.
Precisely. Many are moving production or parts of it to Southeast Asian countries. Vietnam is a big one.
And you can see that in the trade numbers, can't you? Didn't Vietnam's surplus with the U.S. jump massively?
It really did. This relocation was a big factor. Their trade surplus with the U.S. hit $123 billion last year. That's up almost 20% from the year before. A huge economic boost.
Wow.
And those new agreements with China we talked about, even if the full details take time to emerge, they're seen as really significant political signals of China's growing influence. That's according to Shea Wester.
So they signal potential future investment, maybe big investment, in key areas like infrastructure, clean energy, manufacturing.
Right. And these pledges, even if not all of them fully pan out, they still demonstrate new leverage for these Southeast Asian nations. Lynn Cook points out it shows the region is not negotiating from a position of helplessness with Washington.
And that it has alternatives. They have more cards to play now.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, that leverage comes packaged with those pretty significant risks we touched on. And here's where it gets really interesting, I think, and potentially quite concerning for their own economies.
What's the biggest risk then?
Well, a major worry is that as U.S. tariffs slow down the flow of cheap Chinese goods into the U.S., those goods could get redirected. They could flood Southeast Asian markets instead. And that could end up undercutting their industries and eroding employment right there at home.
So hang on. They benefit from Chinese factories moving in, but they risk their existing factories being swamped by cheap imports from China. That's tricky.
Extremely tricky. And government officials, business owners, they're reportedly very worried about this. What does this expanding trade with Beijing actually mean for their own domestic economies and for those very delicate negotiations they're having with Washington?
They feel caught.
Totally caught. Vu Minh Hong from Fulbright University, Vietnam, summed it up really well. He said, Vietnam does not want to side with either the United States or China in the trade war.
Makes sense.
Its worst nightmare is if either of them thinks that it's actually siding with the other one to screw them over.
Right. Nobody wants to be seen as playing favorites when the stakes are this high.
Yeah.
And beneath all this economic stuff, there's still the geopolitical tension, right?
Yeah.
China and the South China Sea, for example. That must add another layer of caution.
Oh, absolutely. Despite all the economic ties, the opportunities, the sources emphasize these countries aren't going to put all their eggs in China's basket. That's Carla Freeman's take. They're very aware of the risks of becoming too reliant.
To really get our heads around this, though, we probably need to zoom in a bit more, move beyond the sort of high-level politics and economics.
Yeah.
Look at what's actually happening on the ground, in businesses, for workers.
Yeah.
because the sources give some really striking examples there.
And this really raises an important question for us, doesn't it? How do these huge global trade policies, these superpower tensions, how do they actually filter down and affect the daily lives, the livelihoods of real people? The sources take us to Binh Duong. It's a big manufacturing hub outside Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And, well, the picture there isn't necessarily rosy for everyone right now.
We hear about factories slowing down quite a bit. Why is that happening?
It seems directly linked to the trade uncertainty. U.S. importers are apparently holding back on orders. They're waiting to see how things shake out, with the negotiations between the U.S. and Vietnam. They're hesitant.
Worried about potential tariffs or policy shifts?
Exactly. They don't want to commit to big orders if the rules might change.
That must be hitting the workers hard.
It really is. There's a quote from Do Viet Than Nan. He's a 50-year-old production manager at a furniture factory there. He says this disruption is actually worse than what they went through during the peak of the COVID pandemic.
Worse than COVID. Wow.
Yeah, he's had to slash overtime, cut wages, sometimes even kind of artificially keep production numbers up just to try and avoid laying people off.
And it's not just the employees feeling it, right? Business owners, too.
Absolutely. Nguyen Thi Minh Thu, she owns a furniture factory, relies heavily on exports to the U.S. She says her orders have dropped so much that only about half her workforce is currently active. And her anxiety, it's compounded by that exact risk we just talked about, the potential flood of more Chinese manufacturers moving into Vietnam.
Ah, the competition concern.
Right. She worries they'll undercut Vietnamese businesses because, their scale, their supply chain advantages. She says, quote, "When Chinese companies get too big, it also causes problems for Vietnamese business. It's that complex fear again. You benefit from the relocation, but you fear the competition it brings."
Yeah, these stories really bring home the immediate kind of human cost of this trade conflict. But the sources also highlight another really fundamental challenge here.
Which is?
Even if countries want to reduce their reliance on China, maybe diversify their supply chains, it's just incredibly difficult because China is so deeply, deeply embedded.
That's a critical point, absolutely critical. And we hear that loud and clear from someone like Bak Quang Minh. He's 52, owns 4 garment factories in Ho Chi Minh City.
Okay.
And his businesses, they supply major U.S. retailers. Think Walmart, Costco, Nike, big names.
Right, so he's directly plugged into the U.S. market. How dependent is he still on China, though?
Profoundly. About half his sales still actually go through large Chinese exporters or intermediaries.
Half. Wow.
Yeah. But the really tough part is the raw materials. He says at least 70% of the fabric his factories use comes directly from China.
70%. Okay. So why is it so hard for him or others like him? Why can't they just switch suppliers? Or, bypass those Chinese middlemen and sell directly to the U.S.?
Well, he breaks it down. It comes down to scale, capital, and infrastructure, basically. He says he just can't compete with those big Chinese intermediaries. They have way more capital. They invest massively in R&D. And they've pretty much locked down the logistics for getting goods delivered efficiently and cheaply.
In the fabric itself, why is that so China dependent?
Well, he points to a very practical reality. The specific types of materials, the fabrics that American buyers expect, they're just difficult to produce elsewhere at the scale needed. Only Chinese factories with their huge scale, their technical know-how, can reliably produce them in the massive quantities required, and crucially at the low cost needed to keep final prices competitive for those U.S. retailers.
Wow. Those quotes from him really hit home. He says it's very, very difficult, and change can't happen overnight.
Yeah. And he puts it bluntly, China is still the biggest producer.
So it really shows that even if there's political will, or maybe even an economic incentive to diversify away from China, it just runs smack into the reality of these decades-old, deeply integrated supply chains.
Exactly. It's not something you can just flip a switch on.
So this deep dive into Southeast Asia, it really feels like more than just a regional story, doesn't it? It feels like a snapshot of something much bigger happening globally.
I think so, too.
We mentioned earlier that ASEAN, that's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, others in the region, is already China's largest trading partner. So that integration, it's already incredibly deep.
Oh, yeah. China's economic ties there go way back, predating a lot of this current trade war stuff. China accounts for something like 17% of its total exports going to that region.
Wow.
So that established relationship, it provides a foundation for trade to continue, but it also adds layers of complexity when you're trying to pivot or react to new pressures.
Right.
We also saw Malaysia, for instance, recently exploring talks with Beijing about managing their exports or maybe discussing the value of the yuan, which affects how cheap Chinese goods are.
Trying to manage the fallout?
Pretty much. A senior Malaysian official was quoted saying the U.S. tariffs were beyond what was expected, and that's what's pushing them to have these kinds of, well, perhaps difficult conversations with Beijing. It shows how even established partners are scrambling to manage the disruption.
So what does this all mean then? We've looked at how Southeast Asian countries are walking this incredibly fine line, this tightrope,
Yeah.
balancing potential opportunities from, say, trade shifts and Chinese investment with the very real risks of being squeezed between these two superpowers and grappling with that deep, deep integration with China's economy and supply chains.
And if we kind of zoom out and connect this to the bigger picture, the situation in Southeast Asia, it isn't just about tariffs or geopolitics in the abstract. It feels like a microcosm
A microcosm of what?
of the really complex, interdependent relationships that are truly shaping the global economy right now. It's where these abstract forces, like trade wars, actually meet the concrete realities of factory floors, shipping containers, people's jobs.
Yeah. We've definitely unpacked a lot today about the intense pressures, the difficult realities these countries are facing as they try to navigate being essentially a key battleground in this ongoing U.S.-China dispute.
It's a tough spot.
It really is. So maybe a final thought to leave people with,
Okay.
given those really specific practical details we heard from people like Bak Wan Min, the garment factory
Or
owner.
meet the fabric dependency.
Right. Exactly. But just how profoundly China is embedded in these global supply chains. Even for basic goods like fabric, the sheer difficulty, the cost of sourcing that stuff elsewhere at the scale needed. How realistic is it really for countries anywhere in the world, not just Southeast Asia, to actually decouple from China in a truly meaningful way,
Yeah.
even if there's a strong political desire to do so?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah. What does that level of ingrained economic connection tell us about the future? About the resilience of these global trade flows when they come up against intense political pressure?
Something to definitely keep mulling over.
Absolutely. Something for you to keep mulling over.